me to Acts chapter 27. Man, praise the Lord for rain. We have needed rain so bad. And then today and yesterday, awesome. Thank you, Lord. We were just talking about rain Wednesday night. The miracle of rain. What a miracle rain is. If you want to know more about that, read Amos in chapter 5. I think it's chapter 5. About it's God that takes the rain, takes the water from the oceans and causes it to fall on the earth. It's pretty amazing when you consider that. And so we've been needing rain, so praise the Lord for rain. All right, so Acts chapter 27. Guys, if you have been with us, you know we've been in Acts for, a year, something like that. Really, we've been in Acts for about a year, maybe a little longer, right? Chris, he texted me the other day, told me exactly how long. It's been almost a year, right? Or a little over a year. And so now we're coming to the end. Now, you guys have noticed that we've sped up through these last few chapters of Acts, and it's not because I want to get through Acts, but it's because it's a strict narrative. Now, the book of Acts in general is a narrative, right? It's a story. It's an account. It's a historical account written by Luke to let us know what happened through the Acts of the Apostles, what was going on in the early church, and how the Lord used his apostles and his prophets to go out into the world and to expand the church. But as we've been coming to the end, we're winding down and we're seeing the end of the life, the end of the ministry of Paul. I wouldn't say the end of the ministry, definitely the end of his free ministry, the end of his freedom. He's been taken into custody at this point. And when we get into chapter 27, this is going to be Paul's journey to Rome to stand trial before Caesar Nero. That's what's happening here. And so Paul, as you remember, is in Caesarea at this point, and he was taken into custody over 2 years ago. He's been imprisoned in Caesarea now, and he was taken in custody by a Roman centurion who really saved his life from the Jews who were going to kill him. They were murdering him there. They were actively engaged in trying to murder Paul, right? They were beating him to death. And so he rescued him from that. They stood trial before the Sanhedrin. That didn't go so well. They sent him out to Felix, and then Felix kept him in custody for 2 years. Festus takes over, and then he appeals to him. He stands trial before him. Then remember in Acts chapter 26, King Agrippa comes in, and Paul makes this amazing address to King Agrippa and to Bernice and all of the people of prominence that are there. And Paul appeals to them. He pleads with them about the gospel of the Lord. He pleads with them about the truth of Jesus. Now, what I find amazing about this is that Paul doesn't necessarily appeal to his innocence. He doesn't say that he should be set free. He's not appealing for that. He's not even arguing to be set free. What he's doing is taking the opportunity to share the gospel with those who are in power. Now, it's a powerful chapter. And what I find so amazing about chapter 26 is that if I were to try to pick a chapter to preach on a day where we had all of these visitors come in that maybe didn't know the Lord when we did our baby dedication, I don't know that I would have picked Acts chapter 26, but then after preaching through it, I don't know that there's a better one. The Lord did that. He orchestrated it. He made it that way. He made it to where we had all these visitors to come to see babies being dedicated, all these extended family, and the gospel was presented in a powerful fashion through Paul. He presents the gospel in such a way that you cannot deny the truth of it. In fact, King Agrippa comes to the point where he says, "You almost convinced me to be a Christian. You almost did it." And so then King Agrippa and Festus talk to each other in private, and they say, "Look, this man should be set free. There's no guilt in him at all." And Agrippa says to Festus in verse 32, "This man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." Man, if it wouldn't have been for his appeal to Caesar, we probably would have just let him go. And so then we move into chapter 27. So follow along with me in chapter 27. We're going to I hate to make promises. We're going to kind of move through this quickly. That's the plan anyway. We'll see what happens. But this is this account of Paul heading to Rome, right? They're leaving now from Caesarea and heading to Rome. And so it says in verse 1, "And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. And so entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. Now, this is something interesting. So you guys know, as we've been heading through the narrative of Acts, you guys know the author, the writer of this is Luke, the physician, the same writer of the Gospel according to Luke. And so as he's writing this, we've seen changes throughout the narrative where sometimes he'll say they, when he's referring to Paul and his missionary journey. He's referring to Paul and Barnabas or whoever is with him. And sometimes he says we. And so we have these differences in times when Luke is with Paul on his journey. And at this point, as Paul is heading to Rome, Luke is with him. Luke is with him on his journey to Rome to stand trial before Nero, as well as Aristarchus from Thessalonica, one of the guys that's been with Paul on this third missionary journey that's come back with Paul to Jerusalem, and in fact is a prisoner together with Paul. Paul refers to him in other letters. As he writes his prison epistles, he refers to Aristarchus. And so we know this is a faithful brother of the Lord, brother in the Lord. And so I love that Luke is going with him. Now, listen, I'm not going to be dogmatic about this. This is not strict doctrine. But I tend to believe that Luke wrote the gospel account, and Acts as a sort of legal defense for Paul as he stands before Caesar. He's written all of these things down so that it would be an account of Paul's life and ministry and what happened in the early church, what happened in the ministry of Jesus during the gospel and his life, earthly life on earth, and in his death, his burial, and resurrection, and then following that, what happens through the apostles in the early church. And I believe that this is presented to Nero. And I think that one of the reasons that Luke is going with him is because he's a historian. He's written an account of these things specifically for his trial in Rome. And I like that. I think it's pretty amazing. And so it says, and the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. And when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is all Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And so basically what happens is as they leave Caesarea and they're going to head to Rome, they don't sail across the open sea to Rome. And in first century, they're sailing in a wooden ship. And so they don't like to sail across the open sea, even in good weather, if they can help it. What they do is they skirt along the coast. Just in case something happens, they get shipwrecked, and they have to get back to the shore. They're sailing closer to the shore. And they're making stops on the way to get supplies or to do whatever they need to do. They're making stops in all of these port cities. Now, something that's really cool, or that I think is really cool, is as it's naming these cities, and you can kind of follow on a map Paul's journey, and he comes to this city of Myra. It's interesting that they make an account for us that Paul stopped in Myra. Now, Myra is a famous city in about the 3rd century, and it's famous for one thing. Santa Claus is from Myra. He really is. Believe it or not, if you look up the story of St. Nicholas, he's from Myra. He was the bishop of Myra in the 3rd century. It's pretty interesting, right? So Myra is important if you want to just have extracurricular study. Look that up. Look the history of Myra. Look at all the things that were going on in Myra. And the bishop that was there in the 3rd century named St. Nicholas. It's pretty interesting. And the story of where we get that account from. Anyway, that has nothing to do with what we're going through today. I just found it interesting. Thought maybe you would too. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. And when we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmon. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia. And so here they go. They're heading into these kind of turbulent times. You're going to find out that it's after the fast, so that means it's probably around the beginning of October 5th, and it's after the fast, the Day of Atonement, the given fast to the Jewish people. And in that time, the Mediterranean is a very dangerous place to sail. And so already they're facing trial in their trip and journey to Rome. They knew they were cutting it close when they left Caesarea. They knew it was going to be a difficult journey, and so already they're running into trouble. And they come to this place on the island of Crete called Fair Havens. Now, Fair Havens is a pretty kind of misleading name. Fair Havens is not that fair of a place, to be honest with you. It's not a great harbor. It's a difficult harbor. It's a difficult harbor to sail into. It's a difficult harbor to sail out of. And in difficult times, in turbulent times, in bad weather, your ships could be ruined in the harbor of Fair Haven. It was a difficult town to be in. Not only that, it was a very small, kind of backwoods podunk town off the island of Crete. Okay? And so that's where they are. They're having difficulty, and so they have to pull into Fair Havens to kind of take refuge from the winds and the waves that are going on around them. And in verse 9 it says, "Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, 'Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives.'" So I want you to picture this right now. Paul is a prisoner, okay? He's a prisoner. He's a prisoner along with many other prisoners in this Alexandrian ship. Now, this Alexandrian ship, we know a little bit about this ship, not this specific one, but we know about these ships through history. These are grain ships. This is a ship coming from Africa, bringing grain to Rome, because Rome at this point has over 1 million citizens, and it doesn't have the land to support it. It doesn't have the land to support the agriculture there for all the people, and so they would grow grain in Egypt and in Africa, and they would bring that grain by ship to Italy. And one of these Alexandrian ships, so this is a grain ship bringing supplies to Rome. They're about 140, 150 feet long, about 39, 40 feet wide. It's not a giant ship, but it's a pretty fair-sized ship. And these ships were robust. They were built to last, but they weren't fast, and they weren't easy to maneuver in a headwind. And so they're already having trouble maneuvering this ship through the trouble that they're facing, right? And so Paul then, a prisoner, comes to the centurion, and he's giving his advice on what they should do with their ship. Think about that. Think about that for a second. Here, the owner of the ship is on board, the helmsman, all of the sailors are there, and then you have this prisoner who is not imprisoned for piracy or something like that. What is he in prison for? Preaching the gospel. He's not a sailor. And yet he comes and says, "Hey guys, I don't think this is a good idea. We shouldn't press on." You can imagine that probably doesn't go over well with the people in charge, right? Verse 11, it says, "Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul." And I don't blame him. I don't blame him. Yeah, I would be too. I would go to the captain. I would go to the helmsman and say, "Hey, what do you guys think?" "No, we're good. We can do this. We've done it many times. We've sailed this ship for many years. We know what we're doing. Don't worry about what this prisoner says. You just trust us." And I would say, "Yeah, okay, you're probably right. I trust you more than I trust this preacher from Jerusalem who's been a Pharisee his whole life." But you have to remember, at this point, Paul has logged like over 3,000 miles of sailing time under his belt. In his missionary journeys, he's been around. And at this point, he's already written 2 Corinthians. Okay? And in 2 Corinthians, he makes a list of all the things he's been through. And in that list, he says that he's already been shipwrecked 3 times. And once he spent a night and day in the deep, just floating around. So Paul is saying, look, and I really don't think that at this point he's speaking as a prophet. He's not speaking as a prophet of God, because he says, "I perceive." He doesn't say that, "Hey, just disregard what she's saying. Don't listen to her. She's interrupting us." The TV, that is. It talks. I don't know if you guys notice it. The TV talks when it turns off and on. It's a lady's voice. She never knows what she's talking about. Anyway, it's a distraction. I don't even remember what I was saying. Oh yeah, I don't think Paul is speaking officially as a prophet of God at this point. I just think he's speaking from his experience. He knows that at this point the Mediterranean is a dangerous place to navigate. So from the middle of September until the middle of November, the Mediterranean becomes a very difficult sea to sail in. In fact, it's dangerous, right? That's what it's saying here. It's dangerous to sail. It's after the fast. It's dangerous. They're right at about October 5th at this point. And so Paul perceives, look, it's dangerous. After the middle of November, no one sails in the Mediterranean until March. It's dangerous from mid-September to mid-November, but after that until March, no one sails, period, through the Mediterranean. It's a death wish. And so Paul is saying, look, we could run into serious trouble here. Now, the centurion, though, is more persuaded by what the helmsman says and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. Okay, so what's going on is they are in this port of Fairhaven, and it's on the island of Crete. So they're on the island of Crete, but they're in this small town. You're going to find out they have over 200 men at this point on the ship. This town is not suitable for them to winter in because there's nothing for them to do there. There's not maybe going to be enough supplies for them to have while they're there. And the harbor is a dangerous harbor. And so, because of all the advice given by all the men that are there that have all this sailing experience, they decide that they're going to sail away from Fairhavens and they're going to go to Phoenix. Now, Phoenix is only 40 miles away from where they are on the same island. It's on the same island. So they're going to leave this port, sail along the shore of Crete to come to Phoenix, and they're going to pull into that port, a much larger city that could support them through the winter, and they're deciding that they're going to winter there in Phoenix on the island of Crete. Seems like a pretty good idea. You think, man, 40 miles, that's nothing, even compared to the distance that they've traveled so far. And they're just going to skirt the island that they're already on. They don't have to sail over the open sea. There's nothing really that could dissuade them from going to Phoenix. And so they think, yeah, this is a good idea. And they get on the ship and they begin to sail. They're going to decide to winter there, only 40 miles away from where they are. Then in verse 13, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. So they wait in the harbor of Fairhaven until the weather is good, right? The wind is blowing softly, the seas are calm, everything seems well, and so they say, let's do it now. Now is a good time, seems like the Lord is opening the door for us, let's go. Seems like an open door, right? So they decide to go. They sail close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. So Euroclydon is basically a typhoon, right? It's a storm that the people of the Mediterranean know about. They know about the storm. They fear it. They even fear it so much they give it a name, right? Euroclydon. It's this like typhoon. It's a very, 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 very dangerous wind. And so they're right there near the island of Crete. They can't just pull in anywhere. They're having to try to get to a harbor that they can pull in, and then this terrible storm comes upon them, right? And so when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. Now remember what I said. These ships are well built. They're sturdy. They're strong. They're not very fast. They're pretty slow, but they're sturdy ships. But because of the way they're designed, they have a very difficult time sailing into the wind. They can't really make headway very well when the wind is contrary to them. And so this is exactly what's going on, right? The wind is blowing ahead of them. They can't make way into the wind because it's a fierce wind. And so when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. So basically what that means is they take down the sails and they let the ship drive. They let the wind drive the ship. They're at the mercy of the storm at this point. Completely at the mercy of the storm. I mean, in these ships, they don't even have a real rudder. They have like these big giant paddles at the stern of the boat that they would use to direct the ship. So at this point, man, when the storm comes on them, they don't really have much choice but to let the storm drive. And so that's what they do. They take down the sails because the way these ships were built, they'd have one giant mast in the middle and then a mast at the front. And normally in a ship, in a storm, if you leave the sail up, it puts too much pressure on the mast, and then what can happen is it can break the ship apart. And so they take it down, and they just let the storm drive. They're completely and totally at the mercy of the storm. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. And when they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. So I want you to just picture this for a second. Here you are, a prisoner, on your way to Rome to stand trial before Nero. And now you're coming to the men and saying, look, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think we should sail. We know it's difficult to sail right now. We're in a harbor. This is a decent harbor. We should just stay here and winter here. And the men are like, no way, man. We're going to Phoenix. And so when they strike out, all of a sudden this great storm comes upon them and is driving them. They have really no choice but to just let it drive. They can't really do anything. Then they come under the shelter of this island and they pull in the skiff. It's basically like a dinghy that they pull behind the boat, and they pull it in with great difficulty. And once they finally get it on board, it says that they gird. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship. They're frapping the ship together. Basically, what they're doing is they're trying to make it to where the storm doesn't tear this wooden ship apart. So they're wrapping cables around it, and they're cinching these cables with these, basically these come-along type things where they're cinching the ship together so it doesn't come apart in the storm. And now they're fearing that the ship is going to drive them onto the Syrtis sands. Now these are famous reefs off of the coast of North Africa where it's basically a graveyard for these ships. And as these storms would blow them, they would run aground on these reefs there off the coast of North Africa, and it would break the ships apart and everything would be lost. And so in light of that, thinking that that's what's going to happen, they raise this front sail so that they can steer. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. So what does that mean? It means they're throwing stuff overboard. This is a serious storm. This is a dire situation. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have ever been out on the water, out on the ocean in a storm, but it's scary. Now, I love the ocean. I love being out there. I love spearfishing. I love being out deep, right, where you can't see shore. But I can tell you, when a serious storm rolls up on you, you realize you are completely at the mercy of the storm. There is nothing you can do. And so at this point, they don't even have engines on the boat. They don't have anything. They don't have enough supplies to really ride this thing out. And so they're at the mercy of the storm. Not only that, can you imagine being in a wooden ship knowing that this storm could tear the ship apart? And you're having to wrap cables around the ship to hope that the ship doesn't come apart? So now they start throwing off supplies. They start throwing things out of the ship. And now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. Listen to that. It says when no sun or stars were visible for many days. You know what that means? It means that they had no idea where they were. They had no way of judging where they were. They had no way of judging where they were going. They didn't know anything. They had no GPS on board at this point. They had no radio. They couldn't call out to anybody else around them. They were completely isolated and alone and had no idea where they were and where the storm was driving them. They had no idea. And so at one point, it says that all hope was lost. All hope that they would be saved was completely given up. Now, think about this for a second. If it says, all hope that we would be saved was given up, was finally given up, who do you think, out of everybody on board, do you think anybody held on to hope? It seems like no, right? It says all hope was lost. Maybe even Paul himself said, yeah, this is it, we're going down. I mean, he's already been through 3 shipwrecks at this point. So he knows what it takes to wreck a ship, and he's saying, look, we're in the midst of it, man, over and over again every day. We don't know where we're going. We're losing track of time. We're losing track of our bearings. We don't know where we're heading. And yeah, no one's going to save us. No one's going to be able to find us. But after long subsistence from food, after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me. I love that. I love that. Right in the middle of all the trouble, Paul stands up, and you are expecting something great from Paul, right? All right, this is a prophet of God. He stands up in the midst of all this trouble. We haven't eaten in many days, and I don't know why. I don't think they're fasting and praying. Most of these guys are pagans, right? I don't think they're fasting and praying. I think maybe they're seasick. Maybe there's not enough rations for them to eat. Maybe they're trying to maybe it's too harsh for them to even eat, right? And so after many days from abstinence from food, Paul stands up in the midst of them. And often when Paul stands up in the midst, he has this great thing to say. So here's Paul standing up in the midst, and he says, you should have listened to me. I told you not to sail. And you can imagine in that moment that everybody's like, I don't want to hear it. That doesn't help anything. Have you ever been in a situation where you know that somebody said to you, listen, any of you married men and women know that you've been in a situation where your significant other has said, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. And yet you do it anyway, and it falls apart, and then they look at you and say, told you so. Listen, that doesn't help anything. That's not a good feeling. I love that Paul starts like that. It shows his humanity, right? It shows his fallible nature. It shows that, listen, he's just like us. And so he stands up in the midst and he says, I told you, you should have listened to me. Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart. So he does have something to say, does he not? First he says, look, you should have listened to me. Now we're incurring this loss and destruction, but I urge you, take heart. Now listen, that phrase, take heart, is kind of lost on us, right? We know what it means, but at the same time, it's not something that we necessarily say, or it's not something that strikes us when someone says, take heart. But what Paul is saying is, be courageous. Be filled with courage. Because at this point, all hope has been lost. All hope of being saved is gone. Everyone has let go of the hope that they had, that someone would find them, someone would come alongside them and help them. They've let go of all of that hope. And then Paul stands up in the midst and he says, be courageous. Now listen, when you're in the midst of disaster, when you're in the midst of a storm, where you could genuinely lose your life or lose everything dear to you, and someone comes along and says, hey, cheer up. That's not always an easy thing to do. When someone comes alongside you in the midst of your trouble and they say, be courageous, that's hard. That's difficult. And listen, in and of yourself, you can't do it. You can't. But Paul is about to tell them why they should take heart. Paul is going to give them reason to be courageous even in the midst of a storm. Paul comes to them and says, be courageous, take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Now, I want to remind you of something for just a second. Paul says, listen, be courageous, take heart, be brave, for there shall be no loss of life, but only of the ship. They're on the ship, okay? That is not that comforting. In the midst of this, when you're in the ship, and Paul says, hey guys, don't worry, because we're only going to lose the ship that we're on. And at that time, you could say, wait a minute, I don't want to be in the ocean. I don't want to be stranded out here. I don't want to have to go through that. But Paul is saying, look, an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood by me, and he said that everyone on this ship is going to survive. That you have to stand before Caesar. Now think about this with me for a second. Yeah, that might sound terrible to the people who are on the ship, that they're going to lose the ship, that the ship that they are clinging to for life, the ship that they think is what's going to deliver them, the ship that they think is what's giving them safety is going to be destroyed, but God is going to protect them. In the midst of tragedy, God will preserve their life. I think they have to lose the ship. I think they have to lose the ship so that they can come to a deeper understanding of who the God that Paul serves is. They think that it's the ship that protects their life. They think that it's the ship that they should be clinging to, but really, the ship is going to be destroyed so that they can understand it's God who is preserving their life. It's God who is the author of their life. It's God who they should cling to. And not just any God, but it's the God that Paul serves. It's the God that Paul belongs to. He is going to preserve them. He is going to give them life. Now listen, what the angel says to Paul is striking to me. Because the angel doesn't say to Paul that we're going to preserve your life and also everyone else on the ship. What does he say? Listen to this. This is important. Saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Now, what does that mean? What this says to me is that Paul was praying for everyone on the ship with him. Now, why do I say that? Why do I say that Paul was praying for all the people on the ship with him? It's not because this is happening, so that must mean Paul was praying for it. No, because the angel said God has granted them to you, which means Paul was interceding on their behalf. Paul was coming to the throne room of grace and saying, these men who have imprisoned me, these men who are delivering me, maybe to my certain death, Lord, would you preserve their life? God, would you come alongside them? Would you interfere in some way so that they could know you? Would you save them from their storm that they're in? Now listen, guys, together we are in a storm. We're on this ship together. We're heading through the storm of life around us, all these things that we face, all these trials and hardships that we're going through. Do you recognize that there are people around you that are in the storm with you that do not know the Lord? Are you praying for them? Or are you just praying that you would be delivered through the storm? Listen, often I'm praying that I would be delivered through the storm. And I don't think that's a bad prayer. I don't think there's anything wrong with that prayer. I think that we should be praying and recognizing who is guiding us and directing us, who is taking us through the storm. We should remember that. We should be intimately aware that God is the one who knows the number of our days. God is the one who gives us the breath in our lungs. The Lord is the one who guides us through these storms. But ultimately, his heart is that we would be praying for the ones around us. And listen, the fervent prayer of the righteous availeth much. And so as Paul is interceding on behalf of these men who don't know the Lord, that are in the storm with him, God grants them to him. And he says, no one will lose their life. I've granted all these men to you, Paul. That's amazing. And listen, the Lord is faithful to do that in your life. Listen, where you work, where you live, whatever sphere of influence you have in your day-to-day life, the Lord could grant you those people. Are you praying for them? Are you interceding for them? Are you coming to the throne room of grace and asking the Lord to spare them, asking the Lord to shine the gospel in their hearts so that they would be awakened to the truth of who he is? Are you coming before the throne of grace and interceding and laying yourself down before God and begging him to save the souls of the people around you? I believe Paul was. Even the people that were afflicting him. Even the people that were coming against him. Even the people that were going to deliver him ultimately unto his death. Paul was interceding for them. Now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men. For I believe, God, that it will be just as it was told me. Listen to that. He starts this plea to the men on the boat as, take heart, be courageous. Now listen, every time Jesus comes to someone and he deals with their emotion in the midst of the situation, he always first deals with the emotion before he gives them the reason why. And so you think about the widow in Nain, and as her son had died, he comes to her and he says, "Don't weep." Now listen, her son died. It's hard in that moment to listen to the words of Jesus. And you think about Jairus as his daughter, as he just received word that his daughter had died. What does Jesus say? Do not be afraid. Don't be afraid. He first deals with the emotion of the situation. He first speaks directly to the emotion, and then he gives you the reason why. But first, he just asks you to trust him. And Paul, in the same heart of Jesus, first comes to the men and says, "Be courageous, because an angel told me we're all going to live. Therefore, because what the Lord has told me, be courageous. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me." Now, this is important. Paul doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in God that he will save him. Paul believes God. It's the same for us, right? We've talked about this before, this promise that we enter into, this promise that we're grafted into, the promise made to Abraham. Abraham believed the promise of God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Abraham didn't believe in God. I mean, of course he believed in God, but that wasn't what he was accounted righteous for. He believed God about the promise, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And it's the same for us. When we believe God about the promise he made through the Messiah, it's accounted to us for righteousness. But that doesn't stop our journey of belief in the promises of God. As God makes us a promise through his word, and he speaks to us in his word, we are to believe that. And Paul puts that on display for us. He says to all these men who don't know the God of Israel, by the way, who don't know Jesus, he comes to them and he says, "Look, I believe him at his word. I take him at face value. He told me this. He completely put it on my heart to tell you this, and now I believe it's going to be just as it was told me." However, we must run aground on a certain island. However, we are going to have to be shipwrecked. So yes, the Lord is going to deliver us, but it's not going to be easy. Now, the Lord has made us a promise of where we're going, right? He made Paul a promise that he's going to make it to Rome. He promised Paul that he was going to speak before Caesar in Rome, that he was going to be a witness of Jesus in Rome. He told him that while he was back in prison in Jerusalem. That he said, "Hey man, you were a witness here of me, and you're also going to be a witness to me of me in Rome." So Paul knew that. This whole time he knew that he was going to Rome. And yet, when an angel appeared to him, he told Paul to not be afraid. So Paul was still afraid. Paul knew that the Lord had spoken to him and promised him that he was going to Rome. But even in the midst of it, he was doubting. Even in the midst of it, he was fearful. And the Lord said, "No, you're coming to Rome. You have to come before Caesar. You have to go there, but it's not going to be easy." And listen, the Lord has made you promises in your life. The Lord has specifically promised your heart certain things. But he never said they were going to be easy. The Lord promises that he's going to use you mightily in this world if you're filled with the Holy Spirit and submitted to him to do his work. He promises that he's going to work through you, but he never said it would be easy. The Lord promises us that we're going to make it to eternity together with him. 1 Peter says that we have an inheritance, undefiled, incorruptible, that fadeth not away, and it's reserved in heaven for us. And we're kept to it by the power of faith. That's an amazing promise, right? But then throughout that whole letter, Peter is speaking to the suffering Christian. Peter is speaking to the Christians who are facing hardship in their life. Jesus promises us that we're going to face hardship. But we have an amazing inheritance that we're kept to by the power of God through faith. No one ever promised us an easy life. And I think often Christians stumble in this life because they come to Christ, they come to the Lord thinking that now everything's going to be easy, now everything's going to be perfect in their life, health, wealth, and happiness, or whatever they're thinking about. And then all of a sudden they start walking with the Lord and they're facing persecution, trial, hardship. And they're wondering, "Lord, where are you?" Well, listen, he promised the destination, but he didn't say the journey was going to be easy. It's difficult. But Paul will also say, I'm persuaded that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Paul says that if you are children of God, then you're heirs of God and joint heirs together with Jesus, if indeed you suffer with him, that you may also be glorified together. Listen, those are not easy verses, but it's the truth. But the hope that we have in heaven, the hope that we have of eternity, this living hope that we have in Jesus, the hope of the resurrection, the hope of eternity together with him face to face is what gives us the endurance to walk through this life. And not only to walk through this life like a beaten dog, but to walk through this life victorious in Christ, to finish our race with joy. Remember what Paul says as he's heading to Jerusalem, not knowing what awaits him there, except that chains and tribulations await him. The Holy Spirit bears witness in every city that chains and tribulations are awaiting him in Jerusalem, but yet none of these things move me. And then as he's heading to Jerusalem, he's meeting with the disciples, and they're pleading with him and crying for him not to go to Jerusalem. And he says, why are you breaking my heart like this? I'm ready not only to be in prison in Jerusalem, but also to die for the name of Jesus Christ. I'm ready to suffer, and I'm ready to be put to death for his name's sake. Paul says that he knows that there's a crown laid up for him in glory, a crown of righteousness, because he fought the good fight. In Ephesians chapter 6, it tells us to put on the whole armor of God. Now, why would it tell us to put on armor if we were not going into a battle? It's going to be a difficult journey with many blessings along the way, many reasons to praise, many amazing things that happen in our life, God pouring grace upon mercy in our lives, and we should have reason to celebrate every day, but he never promises that it's going to be easy. Paul knows that. In fact, he knows that better than most. But he believes God that it will be just as it was told me. However, you must run aground on a certain island. Now, when the 14th night had come, listen to that. For 14 nights after that, they see neither sun nor stars. They don't know where they are. There's no small tempest is on them. That means it's only big ones. That's what no small one means. It's only serious storms that are coming upon them every day, every night, all day, every day. No stars nor the sun in the sky. Now, for 14 days, they've been enduring this. As we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near to some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. You hear that? That's an interesting term. It says that after 14 days, the sailors sensed that they were coming near to shore. Now, I don't know how they sensed it. I don't know if they could hear the waves breaking on shore off in the distance. I don't know what it was. But these are seasoned sailors. These are men that know the sea. And all of a sudden, they come to this understanding that they're getting closer to shore. And so they start taking soundings. And sure enough, it's getting shallower and shallower. And now it's night, and they can't see anything. So they drop 4 anchors out of the stern so that when the sun comes up in the morning, they'll be facing the direction they need to go. And they prayed for morning. These are Romans. These are Roman soldiers. These are prisoners. These are people that don't know Jesus. But now, all of a sudden, Paul has been speaking to them. Paul has been witnessing to them. And I believe that there's a change that's happening on this ship. I believe something has changed in the heart of these men. As they've seen Paul standing up in the midst and saying, take courage, for God has told me these things. The God whom I serve, the one that I belong to, is saying that he's going to preserve your life. And now all of a sudden, as they're getting near to shore and they still can't see anything, they're worried about running onto the rocks. They drop the anchors and they pray for morning to come. Now, I don't know that these men are believers yet, but I believe there's a heart transformation that's happening. And they prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. Now listen to that. So not every heart was being transformed on the ship, because there's these sailors that are putting down the skiff, and it says that they want to escape. Listen to that. It says that as sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. So this is what's going on. There's these group of sailors, and they're putting down the ship. And other people are saying, what are you doing that for? And they're saying, oh, we're just going to the front of the ship because we're going to put some anchors out of the front of the ship. But really, their heart is to escape. So they're lying. They're trying to put down the boat, the skiff, so that they can escape, so that they can leave them stranded there. And so Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Listen to that. Paul says, no. The Lord promised me that every single soul would be saved, and so that every single soul needs to stay together. And so if these men leave, you can't be saved. Think about this. These are the sailors that want to leave. Now the centurion and the soldiers are still on board, but they don't know how to sail this ship. The sailors, the ones who know how to run the ship, are trying to escape. They're trying to flee. They're trying to get out of there to save their own life. And Paul speaks up and he says, no, man, unless these guys stay, we can't be saved because we can't sail this ship. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. These men are trying to let down the skiff thinking they're going to escape. Where are you going? Oh, we're just putting out some anchors. And the centurion comes along and he cuts the ropes, and there goes the boat. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. Listen to that. Listen to the promise that Paul gives them. He says, all right, listen, for 14 days you haven't eaten anything. Now is the time. Let's take nourishment. This is for your survival. You have to eat, and not a hair will fall from your head. The Lord will protect you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Picture that scene. For 14 days, they've been beaten half to death on this wooden ship, not knowing where they're going, not knowing what's ahead of them, not even knowing if they're going to run into rocks. They're worried about running onto these reefs. They don't have any idea where they are. They haven't eaten in 14 days. It's been nothing but wind and rain and terrible seas for 14 days straight. And then Paul stands up in the midst of them and says, hey guys, let's have a meal together. And before the meal, Paul breaks bread and he prays and thanks God for it. Think about that. If you are an unbeliever, not only that, if you're one of these sailors that was trying to get off the ship, you're trying to get away from them, you're trying to flee and save yourself, then Paul stands up in the presence of all of you and gives thanks to God for where you are and the situation you're in and the food he's provided for you. Could you imagine? Listen, there are times in my life when someone is getting on my nerves and I don't feel like praying because of that. Whatever hardship I might be in, whatever silly hardship I'm in, I don't feel like praying. And yet Paul has been, listen, it's not like Paul is going on vacation and runs into a bad storm and he's thankful to God for where he's bringing him because he knows when he gets through the storm it's going to be great. Paul also knows that on the other side of the storm he has to stand trial before Nero and he's going to be in prison in Rome. He's been in prison for the last 2 years and now he's going to stand trial before someone who eventually will take his head from him. He'll die in prison in Rome. And yet, he's giving thanks to God. Man, what an amazing testimony. What an amazing testimony to the unbelievers on this ship. They're saying, even in the midst of this crazy situation we're in, Paul is giving thanks to God. In 1 Peter, Peter says to the suffering Christians, he says, always be ready to give a defense, to give an apologia to anybody who would ask you for the reason for the hope that's within you. He's saying that to people who are in the midst of suffering. Why? Peter is reminding the Christian that they should live in such a way, even in the midst of suffering, that people around them would say to them, why do you have so much hope in the midst of all of this hardship? What is the reason for this hope that's within you when everything around you seems to be falling apart? Paul recognizes that in this moment, as he gives thanks to God, it's spurring the hearts of the people around them to ask him, how can you be thankful in a time like this? And then he can preach the gospel to them. He can say, I'm thankful because my sins are forgiven me. I'm thankful because of all the failures that I've had in my life. God has forgiven me. Though my sins are like scarlet, they've been washed white as snow. And now I have the privilege to stand before a holy God and to be called a son of the Most High God, that he sees the perfect righteousness of Christ in me, that when he looks upon me from heaven, he sees me as perfectly righteous in his Son, so the world can take nothing from me, that even if I died in this storm, I go to be with my God for all eternity, where he shows the richness of his glory in his kindness towards me. I have every reason to be thankful. I have every reason to thank God for the moment that I'm in, even when it's terrible. Listen, I recognize that's easier said than done. I recognize that that is a difficult thing. But if you really consider what the Lord has done for you, you have the only correct response is to thank him for whatever you're going through. Listen, that doesn't mean that you should be thankful necessarily for the hardship, but thankful for what God is doing through it. James says to count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Listen, he doesn't say count the trial that you're in joy. He says count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that God is doing something through it. So it doesn't mean that you have to enjoy persecution. It doesn't mean that you have to enjoy hardship, but you can enjoy the presence of God in it. You can enjoy what God is doing for you through it and what God is using it to do in the hearts of other people. There's every reason to have joy in the midst of trial. And Paul recognizes that he has every reason to be thankful. So he takes the bread, thanks the Lord for it, and he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food for themselves. And in all, we were 276 people on the ship. 276 people on a 140-foot ship that's about 40 feet wide. That's a lot of people on a ship, not to mention they have tons of grain on the ship, right? So when we had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. They got rid of everything. And when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors, and they left them in the sea. And meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. I love this. I love this testimony. Listen, even all the way to the end, the Lord is protecting all of the people on the ship and making good to his word. The Lord said to Paul through an angel, look, everyone on the ship has been granted to you. Even when the ship is literally being broken apart. That's what that meant. They ran the ship aground, but the stern was still being broken apart by the waves. The ship was literally crashing and breaking apart all around them. And the soldiers, knowing that if any one of those prisoners escaped, it would cost them their life. If they were coming to Rome with 40 prisoners on board and they came with 35, that means 5 of the Roman soldiers would have to be killed to make up the difference. So they knew, look, we don't want any of these guys to get away. It's better to bring a corpse than to have one of them get away. And so they were going to kill all of the prisoners so that they wouldn't be killed. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, made all the soldiers leave first. All the soldiers knew how to swim. That was one of the requirements of being a Roman soldier. One of the things that you had to learn how to do before you could be entered into the Roman army was that you had to know how to swim. And so he says, everybody who knows how to swim, jump over first. That means all the Roman soldiers had to jump over and head for land. And all the prisoners who didn't know how to swim, they had to jump on boards and pieces of the ship or whatever. But the Lord made good to his word. And so listen, this is important. The Lord has made us a promise. He's promised that soon, and very soon, he's coming for us. He said that he's going to prepare a place for us, and that if he goes, he will come again and receive us to himself. In my Father's house are many mansions, many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I go to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, there you may be also. That is a promise that he made his bride. That is a promise that he made to those who trust and believe in him, who are filled and sealed with the Holy Spirit unto the day of redemption. And so listen, whatever the storm looks like around you, whatever you're going through right now, whatever the hardship of your life that you're in, he's made you a promise. Do you believe him? Paul believed him. Paul believed him at his word that it would be just like he said it would be. Do you believe him? Let's pray. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up. Listen, I want to give you guys just a moment to pray, to seek the Lord. Are you in a storm? Listen, everybody in here is walking through something hard, something difficult right now. All, different levels, sure, different amounts of suffering that people go through. But everyone's walking through it. Everyone's going through something. Are you trusting the Lord in the midst of the storm? Or are you just looking at the wind and the waves around you? Are you just looking at the ship breaking apart? Listen, it's the Lord who holds the ship together. It's the Lord who's promised that you're coming to the other side. It's the Lord who has promised that you're getting to where he said you're going. Are you trusting him in it? If not, listen, right now, cry out to the Lord. Recognize that you've taken your eyes off of him. Let him counsel your heart in that. Let him speak to you in the midst of the storm. He would say, be courageous. Take heart. You guys pray.